27 men were trapped on a slab of floating ice in the most hostile ocean on Earth, with no radio, no ship, and only 1 month of food between them. Nobody back home even knew if they were alive. And somehow, more than a year later, every single one of them walked off that ice alive. This is not a movie plot. This actually happened over 100 years ago, and it might be the single greatest survival story ever recorded. Let me walk you through exactly how it unfolded. In August 1914, a British explorer named Ernest Shackleton set sail from England with a crew of 27 men aboard a wooden ship called the Endurance. His goal was almost absurdly ambitious. No human being had ever walked across the continent of Antarctica, and Shackleton wanted to be the first, dragging sleds across nearly 3,000 kilometers of ice in temperatures that could drop far below freezing, using nothing but dogs, sleds, and raw willpower. If everything went to plan, the crossing alone would take around 4 months. Getting there was supposed to be the easy part. The ship sailed south toward a remote whaling station on South Georgia Island, the last outpost of human civilization before the true wilderness of the Antarctic began. From there, the plan was to push through the Weddell Sea, a body of water almost completely enclosed by land on 3 sides, which meant sea ice inside it rarely had anywhere to drift out to. Locals at the whaling station warned Shackleton that the ice that year looked worse than usual, and urged him to wait. Shackleton, driven and stubborn, pushed on anyway. What followed was one of the strangest periods of waiting in exploration history. Winter was approaching, which in Antarctica means total darkness for weeks at a stretch, and temperatures cold enough to make simple tasks dangerous. Shackleton made the call to stay put and let the crew live aboard the frozen ship through the winter months, hoping conditions would eventually free them. Meanwhile, the ice sheet carrying the ship kept drifting, slowly and unpredictably, carrying the men further and further from where they had originally planned to land. Then the ice began to fight back. As the frozen sea shifted and pressed inward, it started crushing the ship's hull like a tin can being slowly squeezed. Cracks appeared in the timber. Planks groaned and split. In late October 1915, after enduring months of building pressure, a slab of ice finally punched a hole through the ship's stern and freezing water began pouring in. The crew fought for 3 straight days, manning pumps around the clock, trying to keep the ship afloat. It was a losing battle. Eventually, Shackleton gave the order nobody wanted to hear: abandon ship. Hay watched from a safe distance out on the ice as the Endurance groaned, buckled, and finally slipped beneath the frozen surface of the Weddell Sea. For many of the men, it was the moment their last physical connection to the world outside Antarctica disappeared. From that point forward, they had no vessel, no shelter beyond makeshift tents, and nothing but a drifting slab of sea ice under their feet. Here is where the real fight for survival began, and where most of us would have simply given up. Shackleton and his men were now castaways on a floating ice floe somewhere in one of the most remote, dangerous stretches of ocean on the planet. They had 3 small lifeboats they'd salvaged from the ship, a handful of sledges, roughly a month's worth of food, and whatever personal items they could carry. Shackleton set a brutal rule almost immediately. Each man could keep no more than about 2 pounds of personal belongings. He set the example himself, leaving gold coins and his own Bible behind in the snow. The ship's photographer had captured hundreds of images documenting the expedition, but under the weight limit, he could only keep a small fraction of the negatives, the ones that would later become the only visual record of everything that happened next. They tried dragging their boats and supplies across the ice toward the nearest island Shackleton believed they could reach, but the surface ice was already softening in the brief Antarctic summer, turning into a slushy, exhausting mess to haul heavy loads across. After hours of brutal effort covering barely more than a mile, Shackleton called it off and decided they'd wait for the ice floe itself to drift closer to land, rather than exhaust the crew trying to force their way across terrain that wasn't cooperating. So they set up a semi-permanent camp directly on the drifting ice and simply waited and drifted for months. Rations shrank to something almost impossible to imagine sustaining a person on. A single biscuit a day, small amounts of diluted milk, and whatever meat they could scavenge. When food ran critically low, they hunted seals and penguins wherever they found them, and eventually made the heartbreaking decision to put down and eat the sled dogs that had traveled with them the whole journey. Shackleton, meanwhile, quietly stretched the truth about how much food they actually had left, understanding that keeping morale intact mattered just as much as keeping stomachs full. A crew that lost hope was a crew that stopped fighting to survive. Fresh water was almost as scarce as food. With no way to melt large amounts of ice quickly, men would hold small tins of ice against their own bodies, using nothing but body heat to slowly produce a few spoonfuls of drinkable water at a time. Lips cracked. Throats went raw. And still, the ice floe kept drifting, sometimes toward hope, sometimes away from it, pushed by winds nobody could control or predict. Eventually, their floating island grew dangerously small and unstable, forcing Shackleton to make another difficult call. They loaded everyone into the 3 small lifeboats and pushed out into open, ice-choked water, rowing and drifting between icebergs, hunting for solid ground. During one especially dangerous night camped on a fresh ice slab, the surface cracked directly beneath their tents and split apart, sweeping Shackleton to one side and the rest of the crew to the other, in complete darkness, with a man having fallen straight into the freezing water in the chaos. Somehow, in the confusion, they managed to reunite everyone and pull the soaked crew member out before hypothermia could take him, keeping him walking through the night until his own body heat dried his clothes enough to save his life. After a grueling stretch in the small boats, battered by freezing spray and exhaustion, the crew finally spotted solid rock rising out of the water. Elephant Island, the last scrap of land before the open ocean, stretched out for thousands of kilometers with nothing beyond it. On April 15th, 1916, after nearly a year and a half without setting foot on solid, unmoving ground, all 27 men finally stood on land again. It should have felt like salvation. In many ways, it was worse than the ice because Elephant Island was completely uninhabited, sat far outside any shipping route, and offered absolutely no way to signal for help. Shackleton studied his charts and realized their only real chance of rescue was reaching South Georgia Island, the same whaling outpost they'd left almost a year and a half earlier, now roughly 1,300 kilometers away across some of the most violent open water on the planet. The stretch of ocean between the tip of South America and Antarctica is infamous among sailors for waves that can rise over 10 meters high, and has claimed thousands of ships and countless lives throughout history. Crossing it in a small open lifeboat sounded close to suicidal. It was still somehow their best option. Shackleton chose 5 men, including his most experienced navigator, and set out in one of the small boats, leaving the remaining crew behind on Elephant Island under the command of a trusted officer, with instructions to hold on and wait. What followed was roughly 2.5 weeks trapped in an open boat, rowing in shifts, soaked constantly by freezing waves, barely able to sleep, occasionally bailing water just to keep from sinking. Navigation depended entirely on brief windows of sunlight each day, since the small crew had no other way to check their position in such a vast, featureless ocean. At one point, a sudden storm nearly finished them just miles from the coast they'd been straining toward for weeks, tossing their tiny boat around in waves large enough to swallow it whole. Somehow, they held together, and on May 10th, 1916, exhausted beyond words, they finally reached the shore of South Georgia Island. But their journey wasn't finished, not even close. They had landed on the wrong side of the island. The whaling station, and the only other humans anywhere nearby, sat on the opposite coast, separated by a mountain range, so treacherous that, up to that point, nobody in recorded history had ever successfully crossed it on foot. Their boat was too damaged to sail around. Walking across uncharted, unmapped, glaciated peaks was, technically, considered impossible. Shackleton picked 2 of his strongest remaining men and set out anyway, without tents, without proper climbing gear, without sleeping bags, navigating entirely by instinct and repeated trial and error. They would climb a mountain, look over the other side, and if the way down looked impassable, climb back down and try a completely different route. This happened again and again. At one especially desperate point, with darkness falling and retreat no longer possible, they resorted to literally cutting steps into the ice with whatever tools they had, lowering themselves down a slope with nothing but a length of rope tying them together. After 36 straight hours of climbing with almost no rest, they finally spotted smoke rising from the whaling station below. When Shackleton and his 2 companions stumbled into the station, they were nearly unrecognizable. Their beards had grown wild, their skin was blackened by frostbite and exposure, their clothes were in shreds. It took the station manager a long moment to realize who he was actually looking at, a man the whaling community had assumed dead for nearly 2 years. Even then, Shackleton's fight wasn't over. 22 of his men were still stranded back on Elephant Island, and he had no idea if they were even still alive. He tried and failed 3 separate times to reach them, turning back each time as pack ice blocked his ship before he could get close. Finally, borrowing a vessel from the Chilean government, he made a 4th attempt in August 1916, and this time broke through. Back on Elephant Island, the 22 men left behind had survived under an overturned lifeboat used as a makeshift shelter, hunting seals and penguins to stay alive through 4 brutal months of uncertainty, never knowing whether their captain had made it across that violent stretch of ocean or drowned somewhere along the way. Every single morning, the officer left in charge climbed a nearby ridge to scan the horizon for a ship, and every single evening he came back down having seen nothing. And yet, morning after morning he kept climbing back up, refusing to let the others lose hope. Then, finally, a ship's silhouette appeared on the horizon. It was Shackleton, keeping the promise he'd made when he first left them behind on that beach. Every one of the 22 men still on the island was alive. Every single member of the original 27-man crew who had sailed south nearly 2 years earlier made it home. Not one life was lost, despite a shipwreck, a winter trapped on drifting ice, starvation-level rations, an open boat crossing of one of the deadliest oceans on Earth, and a mountain crossing that experienced climbers wouldn't dare attempt again for decades. For more than a century, the wreck of the Endurance itself remained lost, sitting somewhere on the floor of the Weddell Sea, its exact location unknown. Then, in 2022, more than 100 years after it sank, a team of researchers using deep-sea sonar and remote submersibles finally located it, resting almost perfectly preserved on the seabed, roughly 3,000 meters down. The extreme cold and the near-total absence of wood-eating marine organisms in that part of the ocean had kept the ship remarkably intact, its name still clearly visible on the stern, exactly where it went down all those decades ago. Shackleton never achieved the goal he originally set out to accomplish. He never walked across Antarctica. But what he did instead has outlasted that original mission by more than 100 years. He brought every single one of his men home alive from conditions that, by almost any reasonable measure, should have killed them. Sometimes the greatest achievement isn't reaching the goal you set out for. Sometimes it's refusing to let the people counting on you give up, no matter how impossible the odds look. That, more than the ice, more than the storms, more than the mountain nobody thought could be crossed, is really what this story is about.